At the end of the day, the answer has always been MAGA is what Donald Trump makes it to be. He decides what is seen as America first, what is seen to make America great again. And you wonder if this is starting to chip away a bit at that definition because so much of the foundational, hype behind the Epstein files did really fan the flames of bringing Donald Trump to office, to bring who they saw as this shadowy circle of elites to justice.
Hi guys, Bernd, welcome back. You were in the slightly cooler UK and now you're back in the sweltering driveway of the White House again. Good to be home?
Yeah, slightly cooler, but at least we have air conditioning on this end.
Well, let's not get into a debate on air conditioning. That would fill a whole other podcast, wouldn't
it? It certainly would. And it's been a hot week for Donald Trump and his MAGA coalition as well, hasn't it? It's been so interesting to watch. And I know the three of us on this pod in the past, we've talked about possible cracks in that coalition, whether there were members of his inner circle, members of his cabinet, also his supporters who might not agree fully with some of his decisions. But this really has come front and center this week, hasn't it?
It has, exactly. I mean, it begs the question, what does it mean to be MAGA now? What does MAGA mean? And would you have ever predicted that the issue of the Epstein files would have been the issue to cause such major cracks, not just within the MAGA base, but within some really high-profile supporters of the president, those people in the news media that are supporters of his, people on Capitol Hill? A lot of questions, a lot of dissatisfaction and unhappiness about how the president and his administration have been handling these so-called Epstein files and sharing what information is there when they've long held that there was this giant cover-up, haven't they?
And one thing I found interesting about that, I was recently speaking to a very diehard MAGA supporter who, made the point that in some ways this is kind of a self-inflicted wound, and that Trump and people who are now in the administration, Pam Bondi in particular, but also, for example, Dan Bongino, they kind of breathed life into the Epstein files before they got to their positions now. So I think in one way that's kind of come around to haunt them now, because what the person said to me was that the options are that either they overpromised and underdelivered, or that there's something to hide in the eyes of a lot of MAGA people.
I feel like there's three options for President Trump, and as you said, Bernie, the members in the administration, and I'd add in the FBI director, Kash Patel, in there as well to the names you mentioned, which is they've been touting this giant cover-up, that there was all this information, a so-called client list of very high-profile, wealthy elites, mostly Democrats, they would say, who past administrations had tried to hide. Now that they're in the administration themselves and they've access to all these files, they've three options. Either they genuinely all believed this giant cover-up, and now that they've seen the information, they've seen there's nothing to see there, it's a nothing burger and it's not true. Or they have seen all the information and realized that there are some things in there that they don't want in the public domain. And so they are now part of the cover-up, which is what I think some in the MAGA world are saying. Or the third option is that they never believed there was a cover-up in the first place, and that this was a kind of convenient conspiracy theory to build profile on, to rile up the base, another thing to kind of beat the Democrats and Joe Biden and Barack Obama with. And now they don't really know what to do with that. And none of those options are good options for the president and his supporters within the administration.
I also think, the reaction in this week and recent weeks is also just kind of compounded, because this is something that's been building slowly for some time. You guys will remember a few months ago, there was Pam Bondi brought in these influencers, many of whom are very influential within the MAGA base. And just here at the Oval Office, they all came out with these binders of files that had been given to them, which turned out to be nothing that wasn't already publicly available.
I was actually there that day, Bernd. I don't know if you were there, because it was the visit of Sir Keir Starmer to the White House. So I was standing exactly where you are now. And they all came out of the doors there under the portico into the West Wing with those folders, holding them up, and they had the Epstein files on them. And us, the awaiting media, standing there for Sir Keir Starmer to arrive, were like, oh my gosh, what are they after being given? And they were all so excited and, oh, wouldn't you like to know what's in here, kind of pointing over to us. And then it turned out once they opened the folders and went through them, there wasn't really anything in there after all.
I think that kind of set off a chain reaction that at the time they were expected that that would be remedied over time, and now it hasn't been. So it's kind of a double anger, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and thinking about, we've been speaking to so many Republican strategists on our programs, haven't we, Katrina, and asking them, okay, is this going to be one of those controversies like some of the others we've seen in these first months of Donald Trump's second term that might just blow over? And I think looking at the reactions that we've seen, real deep rifts within the president's coalition, that it could blow over. We will see other news stories take over the headlines again, but not without consequence. And it did really make me think about that question that you posed, Katrina. What does it mean to be MAGA today? And if you think about the president's win for this term, it really was built on a broad coalition of supporters, something that we saw, of course, in his first term, but expanded in the second term. That does include conspiracy theorists, and that is not to say that there isn't evidence in these Epstein files of perhaps this circle of elites who were being blackmailed. We simply don't know because we haven't seen those files. But there is, of course, if you look at the first term, Donald Trump's first term, we know that he had the support of many QAnon conspiracy theorists. That was another conspiracy at the time driven by this belief that there was a circle of elites involved in pedophilia and sex trafficking. And they were looking to Donald Trump to deliver truth. At the time, that mostly fizzled out. And you wonder if that will be the case this time as well. But at the end of the day, the answer has always been MAGA is what Donald Trump makes it to be. He decides what is seen as America first, what is seen to make America great again. And you wonder if this is starting to chip away a bit at that definition with that disappointment that you guys said, because so much of the foundational, hype behind, excuse me, the Epstein files did really fan the flames of bringing Donald Trump to office, to bring who they saw as this shadowy circle of elites to justice.
And it has always been what he says it is. However, this week, he's now saying that if you don't roll in behind what he and the Attorney General are saying, which is there's nothing to see here, folks, we've put everything out there. If you don't believe him and roll in behind him on that, he's now using words, isn't he, like weaklings, that you're a fool, that you're stupid, that his supporters have been duped by Democrats, that he doesn't even want the support of people like that anymore.
It's all been a big hoax. It's perpetrated by the Democrats, and some stupid Republicans and foolish Republicans fall into the net. They're wasting their time with a guy who obviously has some very serious problems.
So he's really turning on those people. And, there's a saying in politics, if you're still talking about something a week on, you're in trouble. And we're kind of 10 days, nearly 2 weeks on now from when Pam Bondi put out that memo saying, there isn't really anything to see here and there isn't a so-called client list. And even though she had said when she came into office that the client list was sitting on her desk. But if your supporters are so kind of prone to believe what people might think are conspiracy theories in the first place, then they're not going to accept something like this, such a rapid turnaround of the very people who said there was a conspiracy theory there in the first place.
It also, I think it should be said that this has kind of wiped out another discussion that was happening in the MAGA movement over aid to Ukraine, when he announced that there'd be a resumption of U.S. aid to Ukraine. Many people within the MAGA movement, Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, Steve Bannon, they came out against it very forcefully. And this, rupture within the MAGA movement kind of superseded that rupture in the MAGA movement. Mm-hmm. So I think it's interesting how these things have all kind of come out nearly at once, which I think is very difficult for the White House to manage simultaneously.
I think, these previous disagreements, particularly on the war in Ukraine, they have felt like little threads that you could possibly pull at, but not real ruptures. And it is precisely the Epstein files that have felt like an actual rupture in the base. But to your point, Bernie, on delivering weapons to Ukraine, I mean, President Trump made the point very clearly that it is not U.S. money, U.S. dollars that will be sent to Ukraine. It is U.S. weapons purchased by NATO. And in that way, he's trying to placate his base who say, we do not need to be spending billions of dollars on weapons for Ukraine on this war that simply doesn't end. But at the end of the day, he did promise, remember, when he came into office that he would solve this war. And what's become very clear is not only has he not been able to do so, but he's also kind of turned his position and changed his tone, as we've been discussing all week, on President Putin as well, saying that he doesn't believe that he actually wants peace.
I think President Trump rather successfully managed to move on that slight MAGA rupture over Ukraine by very forcefully, as you say, Sumi, stressing that point that this is not American money. And not only is it not American money, but that he had successfully managed to get the Europeans to spend their money, which has always been a big part of the MAGA thing as well, hasn't it? Like, why is the US spending all this money? Why don't the Europeans step up? And I think the president was able to sell that after that initial kind of grumble that actually, look, I've managed to get the Europeans to pay for it and it's not our money. And not only that, they're going to be buying their weapons from the US. So, I think a Patriot costs $1 billion or something like that. So actually, not only are we not spending American money, we're actually getting the benefits. So I think he managed to get on top of that one, but he just can't get on top of this Epstein file thing at all. And speaking to a few people in the MAGA movement as well, they made a really interesting point to me, which was about integrity and credibility. And part of the rise of Donald Trump in the first place was that people felt they didn't trust the government didn't represent them, it was full of elites up in Washington, D.C., everything that we saw coming up in the 2016 campaign. And then suddenly they could trust Donald Trump, and he was there for them, and he was suffering the same sort of inequalities at the hands of the Justice Department and so on that everyday Americans felt they also were suffering. But now, these folks said to me, they feel that trust has been undermined because he's become part of the establishment. Kash Patel, Don Bongino, Pam Bondi, all the others have become part of the establishment as well. And suddenly they feel that they've changed and that the credibility is gone, which I thought was quite fascinating, that it was, not only the Epstein files, but also this something a more cellular connection that they suddenly felt, oh, you're like all the others anyway.
And, I think also, we often talk on the show about the Democrats and how they haven't really found anything to really grasp on. And I think it's really been interesting to watch them this is the first time really, I think in 6 months, I've seen them so gleeful about something, because they're really piling on as well. They clearly see this as an issue that could come back for their benefit in the midterm if there is that satisfaction and some of the MAGA movement decides, well, just going to sit this one out, or they probably don't think they'll work on behalf of the Democrats or vote for them, but they certainly see that dissatisfaction as something they could capitalize on politically.
And I would add, beyond the words that you used, credibility, Katrina, also transparency. Transparency has been a real calling card for this administration. In fact, they point to the fact that President Biden never spoke to the press. Donald Trump speaks to the press 3-4 times a day, doesn't he? The fact that, you really see the inner workings, as we've talked about on this pod before, of foreign policy right on his Truth Social page. And it was interesting, I was talking with a Democrat and Republican strategist on one of our programs in the weekend. The Republican strategist was pointing to what she said was this cover-up, and many Republicans believe there's a cover-up around Joe Biden's mental decline. And we know that President Trump has criticized President Biden heavily and said there must be an investigation into his use of the auto pen and signing the pardons that he did in the last days of his administration. And that call for transparency, when I put that to the Republican strategist on the Epstein files, there was kind of the admission that this is perhaps the first big fault line in that image of transparency that the Trump administration has painted. And that could be one that sticks.
Really interesting as well on the transparency point about the calls for a special counsel to be appointed, because, we saw obviously a special counsel being appointed to Donald Trump, also to Joe Biden during the Biden administration. And it's a real hot potato, isn't it, in the MAGA world, in the Republican world writ large, this notion of a special counsel. And there are some people saying, put a special counsel in now, let's get those documents out from the FBI, out from the DOJ, and see for ourselves what's in there. And Donald Trump was asked about it during the week, and he really kind of brushed it off, like, oh, no, we don't need to do that, or that's nothing to do with me, see the DOJ about it. But perhaps that is the answer. But again, do you satisfy everyone if the president's going to appoint the special counsel or the attorney general is going to appoint the special counsel? Will there be question marks raised over who they appoint? Are they appointing a friendly person to assist in what many people still think is a cover up?
And then in a subsequent interview, he with Real America's Voice, which is very much kind of probably the voice of the MAGA movement in the States, he kind of left the possibility open of the special counsel, which I think shows, how sensitive he is to this debate happening around him, even if he's kind of brushing it off and on social media, kind of dismissing the people that are still talking about it. I think him and the White House are very sensitive to this issue bubbling underneath everything. I think just the reactions we're getting from them, they want to move on and they don't really see how at this point. And just going back to the Democrats, I think one of the more interesting things about both this Epstein case and Ukraine is that it's kind of made this de facto coalition of Democrats and the kind of the more conservative wing of the MAGA movement, which we haven't really seen so far. I mean, given their public statements about one another as movements, it's kind of interesting to see them kind of as bedfellows in this in a certain regard, even if none of them are really coming out and saying so.
Yeah, that's true. And, that's underlined by the fact that there's this big bipartisan bill in the Senate right now as well, on more sanctions on Russia. And that seems to have really garnered a lot of support across the aisle. It's been co-sponsored by Senators Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal. And so that just seems to highlight the fact that there are a number of Democrats and Republicans on the same page right now on the fact that they don't see Vladimir Putin as a reliable negotiating partner. But, when it comes to the Epstein files on Ukraine, we've talked a few times here before, haven't we, on the Democrats trying to find their message and their messenger for that matter. And you've seen different Democrats handling this in their own way, some more effective than others. And they very clearly are calling for the release of the files. Some Democrats in the House introducing legislation to have the files released as well, because they see, as you said earlier, this really as a place where they can not only perhaps score points with their own base, but with some of those disaffected MAGA Republicans who had hoped to see more transparency from the Trump administration on this. So, it's hard to see how Democrats really will find that messenger on this specific issue, but the message here is pretty clear.
Yeah, I've spoken to a few Democrats who are kind of sitting back with the popcorn on this one and, letting that solid base just tear themselves apart from the inside out. And, as we were talking about earlier, the transparency, the Democrats are like, yeah, we can go with that. Let's have transparency. Let's get all the files out, whatever is left there. Because, of course, a lot of these files are before courts at this point or have been recently unsealed. I mean, we saw 1,000 pages unsealed by the courts in New York in January, which fueled a lot of, because there were a lot of names on those lists, weren't there? I mean, there were fully redacted names on those court documents. And there were names like Bill Clinton, Donald Trump was in there himself. That kind of added a bit of extra fuel to the fire of this notion of there being a client list, which the Attorney General is now saying isn't there. And the president himself now trying to turn this into, his latest label for it is it's a Biden hoax, to which the MAGA world has responded, well, if it's a hoax, why did a man kill himself? Why is another woman in jail? If it's a hoax and there's nothing to see here. But, I was speaking to someone who worked in the Biden White House on one of our shows during the week. And I said, were these files discussed during your 4 years in office? Because they just weren't a thing, she said, at that time. Like, as far as we were concerned, the man at the center of it had killed himself. So, that's the end of his legal proceedings, obviously enough. And the other matters were before the court. So it had kind of moved out of our hands in a way. And it's the president and his team who have resurrected it, for want of a better word. And so the Democrats that I've been talking to are kind of like, yeah, we'll just let these guys do this now. I mean, if it's in any way undermining the president's power when it comes to the arm wrangling that we saw happen with the One Big Beautiful Bill Now Act on the House, where it was the president who came in and strong-armed senators and House members, Congress people, to get that over the line. If there's in any way now a suggestion that his power will be weakened with some of those. Well, that's clearly in the Democratic Party's interest.
I just also wonder, it's going to be a challenge for the Democrats to keep this story going until the midterms. I mean, it seems just around the corner, but
Well, yeah, that's a
in
long
the
way
news
off.
cycle, I
Yeah.
mean, there has to be quite a lot, it would take quite a lot of effort, I think, to keep this on people's minds in the longer term, except for those people that are very, very invested in this Epstein story. So I think that presents a challenge to the Democrats.
But I don't think the MAGA supporters will last that long, Bernie. I don't think they'll tolerate another, over a year of this. Even Tucker Carlson the other night said, and he said the words along the lines of, "I'm saying this from a place of love, Mr. President, because, I'm a big fan and supporter," and he used the word love, but this is not good enough. This is not a good enough answer, and we need more, and we need to see more. So I think as long as you have those really vocal people, Marjorie Taylor Greene as well, the Congresswoman, I'm not sure that they'll let it slide that long. I feel like they want something more to it. And of course, the former First Buddy, Elon Musk, has been tweeting or Xing up a storm during the week, really keeping the pressure on this as well.
But I think, even looking ahead to next year's midterms, it was interesting. I saw CNN had a poll about how Democrat voters feel right now. And it says 72% of Democrats and Democrat-aligned voters say they're extremely motivated to vote in next year's midterm elections. So that's a good sign for Democrats. But just 28% of them view the Democratic Party, favorably, which is the lowest mark for them in the history of CNN's polling going back to 1992. So again, clearly Democrats might be able to motivate their voters to vote on some of these issues where they're extremely frustrated or riled up. But who they vote for, or do they feel good about who they're voting for, is another question. And I think that just reminds me that we were talking about the coalition that MAGA has built, this big tent coalition of more and more, for example, people of color, immigrants, people of various backgrounds, working class backgrounds, but also wealthier backgrounds. And one area where the Democrats, to this point, I think, still haven't been able to build a strength is welcoming in some of those disaffected MAGA voters.
And I think it's a really delicate balancing act for many Democrats to not vilify the wider MAGA movement and at the same time kind of acknowledge that there were reasons that many people turned to that movement in the last election, for example, and address those reasons without being overly critical of what got people there. I think that's going to be a messaging challenge for a lot of Democrats who have spent years and years just criticizing the entire MAGA movement.
A big win for them maybe when these cuts to Medicaid actually start to bite, because that is something that affects many of those people who voted for Donald Trump, be they MAGA or be they just Republicans of the older tradition. And once those cuts start coming in a few years' time, I think that will have an impact. I mean, we already saw, didn't we, Senator Josh Hawley, who voted for those Medicaid cuts, coming out basically saying, "Oh, I wish I could change my mind. These are disastrous and they're going to really hurt our people." So, I mean, to the point we were discussing earlier, though, and we say it, I feel like we say it nearly every week on this pod, is like, what are the Democrats doing about this? Who is their person? Who is their leader? What is their message? Because that feels very fragmented.
We're starting to see the governors hitting the campaign trail. Governor Newsom in South Carolina, Governor Andy Beshear of Kentucky out in South Carolina. It's 2028 is not that far away, guys.
Oh my gosh. Feels like there are 10 lifetimes to live before the pace of things here.
Yeah.
But we've lived our lifetime for today on the podcast this week. We got to go, Bernie. We've got to dash back inside the White House there, get out of the heat, but also to do some work, of course.
Find some cold water for the briefing.
Yes. Okay, well, I'll talk to you guys soon.
Okay. Bye, guys.
See you soon.
Bye. If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you, so please do leave us a comment below or email us at path@bbc.co.uk.